Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth.
It's true what people older than you say. They always say that time just flies by. And in fact, they would typically say that time flies faster the older that you get. They also say, ironically, that there's never a time in any of that time when some switch gets flipped where all of a sudden you think, oh, I'm an adult. Or, oh, now I'm old. There is no bright shining line for either one of these things. Now that said, there are some moments that can get reasonably close. When you sign a mortgage, that's a pretty good sign that you're an adult. Doesn't mean that it's a good decision. It just means now you got some serious responsibilities. When you, just experience that time flying, then you are getting older, and I am too. But because that switch never flips, it's very difficult, at least in my own experience, it's very difficult for me to walk into a conversation among adults and think to myself, oh, I'm the old guy in the room. There are younger adults who look at me the way I look at people older than me. And that's just weird. But in some ways, it's a blessing, all of which is a long-winded introduction to today's forever friend. His name is Jason Pejsa. And Jason and I were friends when I was in my mid-20s. And he was in his mid-teens, maybe a little less than 10 years that separated us. I was at the time a student at Reformed Theological Seminary, and I had a job working at Ligonier Ministries. Jason was a high school student whose mother worked at Ligonier Ministries as well, and that's how I got to know him. I think he maybe also attended the church where we attended. And Jason, for a time, would come in and he'd work there at Ligonier under his mother, who was in charge of the shipping department. And he would box up, books and tapes and send them off with other folks. And that's when our friendship started. And I realized, and it was shocking to me, but I realized, there's something of a mentor-mentee relationship here. Now, I'm not saying that Jason thought to himself, I want to become like RC, or I want him to be my mentor. But it was, I was sufficiently older than him and sufficiently more experienced than him that he did come and seek counsel and seek wisdom from me. And that was just encouraging, yes, but also frightening and life-changing. But as always in these Forever Friends segments, one of the things that helped me to deal with that weird feeling was the fact that he's just such a good man, such a fine young man. Jason was one of these kids that the kind of kid who gets a commission to go to military college, like West Point or the Naval Academy. In fact, I think he did go to one of those. I do know that he ended up serving in the military, but he was one of these kids that got great grades, and he was diligent, and he treated his mother with honor and respect. And, in so many ways, I looked up to him. But I did want to, and had the pleasure of, spending time. We would sometimes I don't know, head out to a restaurant and sit down and just eat and talk. And we might talk about music. And in so many ways, he reminded me of me. I remember one conversation we talked about whether this particular band was Christian because they said this or said that in one of their songs. And it just reminded me of me wanting to find ways to see Jesus in the sort of cultural stuff I was taking in, and he was doing the same thing. We talked about his relationship with his mom and with his older sister, and his work and his education, but it was always again fun. I can't get over the fact how often when I look back and think about these friends, how much it mattered to me the kind of smile that they had, how quick they were to smile, and how open and inviting was their smile. And Jason gets top scores on that as well. I mean, for all of his diligence and hard work, he wasn't dull or overly aggressive in pursuing his goals. He was just a fine young man. It's been a long time since I've seen Jason. It's been a long time since I've seen his mom. But every time I do see his mom, I've asked after him. I'm going to see if I can find him. His last name is sufficiently rare that I may have a shot. Once again, as always on these Forever Friends segments, let me ask you to do two things. One, try to do something like this. Send an email to an old friend that you haven't had contact with for a long time and just highlight for them what they meant in your life in that time and that you're grateful to God for them, and encourage them. And then the second thing is, when you've done so, I'd love to hear from you about how it went. Just send me an email. You can send that to hello RCJR at gmail.com. I would love to read that and know. And by the way, if you do send me that, include in that email whether or not you're comfortable with me including, maybe reading it or sharing it, maybe without names or with names, on a future podcast. Thanks so much. What is just war theory? It is already a deep sign of our failure in the church that I have to take the time to define a term. How much deeper is the failure that it's a term that most of us have never really heard of. We are inside the church so historically ignorant that we don't realize that the church itself spent centuries hammering out the answer to a very important question. In what circumstances is it just for an individual or for a nation to wage war? In what circumstances is it just? Now, the greatest of all the just war theoreticians was the greatest of all the theologians in the first 1,000 years of church history, which would be, of course, St. Augustine. And St. Augustine, working together with others, gave us a list of a number of sets of criteria that laid out what he believed was the standards for just war. And then the church sort of wrestled over that and never really improved upon it, though sadly, often we forgot about it. Well, what are some of the criteria that was come up with? Well, first, there is this. In order for a war to be just, according to St. Augustine, one of the things that has to be met is a sense of proportionality. That is to say, you sort of nationally speaking have to not go beyond eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. So that if, for instance, the prime minister of some nation you never heard of, commits a faux pas at a state dinner and offends the leadership, there may be room for sanctions, perhaps, but there's not room for invasion and destruction and pillaging and plundering. So proportionality is important. You don't fire off your atomic bomb in response to some crazed Canadian crossing the border. Secondly, another necessary condition that has to be met for a war to be considered just, and this is a tough one, is it has to be considered winnable. Now, winnable, that is, you don't go to war knowing with almost certainty that you will lose. Now, that doesn't mean you only go to war when you have certainty that you will win, but there has to be some level of confidence that this is possible. So once again, if some country, Lithuania gets all angry at the United States, and the United States has wronged Lithuania, let's say that we sent our troops into Lithuania and crossed over their land on our way to some other battle somewhere, it would not be a just war for Lithuania to invade and seek to overturn the government of the United States, because they wouldn't have a chance. The third rule, though, the third prerequisite for war to be considered just, which is by far the most important, is the idea that we are only to wage war after we have been attacked. We're only to wage war after we have been attacked. So, to put it another way, the only just war is a defensive war. And by the way, it's not like you just have to meet one of these criteria. If you fail to meet any of the criteria, then, according to the thinking, you haven't got a just war. Now, there are still things to figure out. I don't want you to get the idea that you can take a given circumstance, plug it into some algorithm, and out comes a clear, easy answer. For instance, both the questions of proportionality and winnability are not always easy to discern. And I would add, too, that it's not necessarily easy to discern when a war is defensive. But I would say this, that part of the reason for this whole principle is you don't go to war over saber rattling. That is, for a war to be defensive, you have to be assaulted first. Now, again, I'm not saying that when a group of angry bombers are flying over Pearl Harbor and you're standing there with your anti-aircraft guns, that you have to wait for the bomb bay door to open before you can shoot at them. I am saying, however, that just because you think they might invade, or just because you think they might have weapons of mass destruction, or they even claim to have weapons of mass destruction, it doesn't mean you can go to war right away. Now, we are in a time and in a place where this is vitally important. In fact, the last time this standard was met would have been 2001, one could argue, and even there it's messy, because who are you going to war against? But prior to that, the last time this standard got met was World War II. And in between those two wars, there were a lot of wars, and tens of thousands of soldiers from the United States died. Don't buy into this view that says, oh, well, all that matters is if it's strategically to our advantage. In fact, that's one of the weaknesses that the church has had over the last 50 years. Christians tend to wave our flags and repeat the jingoisms and celebrate victories over nations that did us no harm. In fact, we've treated the deliberate exposing of our own soldiers to danger and the deliberate killing of, quote, enemy soldiers as mere matters of policy. The horror, however, isn't that we've been wrong, that we've failed a test. The horror is that soldiers and civilians have died. Mothers have lost sons, children have lost fathers, and they've died fighting when and where they should not have fought. They died not as heroes, but as tragedies. And all of us who stood behind this stand guilty, with blood on our hands.
You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.